3 years ago, I told you about Arnold Ridley, the actor who played Private Godfrey in Dad's Army, and his real service in both World Wars. After being invalided out of the army, wounded at the Battle of the Somme, Ridley was approached by a woman who had the audacity to hand him a white feather for cowardice. But Ridley wasn't alone. The woman who handed him that white feather was part of something much bigger and much darker in World War I. Orchestrated by a retired admiral, supported by the Suffragettes, and drawing on the imagery of the adventure novel and later film set in Sudan, The Four Feathers. For the men on the receiving end, it resulted in fear, humiliation, and even suicide. Men like Ridley were picked on by the Order of the White Feather, including one man who had received the Victoria Cross at Gallipoli. This is the forgotten story of the World War I White Feathers. The white feather as a cowardice symbol goes back to the 18th century. According to a Georgian slang dictionary printed in 1785, the phrase comes from cockfighting, the gambling sport of Georgian England found in every market town. True fighting cocks didn't have a single white feather in their tails. A white feather, therefore, meant that the bird was a mongrel, bred with common domestic stock, and not a true fighting bird. Thus it was likely to turn tail rather than fight. Showing the white feather, therefore, literally meant behaving like a chicken that runs away. The phrase passed from cockfighting into common speech, and by the time A.E.W. Mason published his adventure novel, The Four Feathers, in 1902, the white feather was recognised throughout Britain as the mark of cowardice. The story was set against the real backdrop of the 1882 Egyptian campaign and the follow-up campaigns in Sudan. Harry Faversham resigned his commission on the eve of his regiment leaving Britain and was given 3 white feathers by his brother officers and a 4th by his fiancée. He spends the rest of the story performing acts of bravery to win back his honour. The novel has been filmed 7 times. Possibly the ones that you might have seen were the 1939 Korda version, set against the Battle of Omdurman, and in which featured John Laurie, the future Private Fraser in Dad's Army, as the Khalifa. Storm Over the Nile, made in 1955, and the 2002 Heath Ledger-Kate Hudson version. In this last version, the British lose at Abu Klea, though in reality the British never lost a battle against the Mahdists. I bet you've seen at least one of them, and I'd love to know which version you prefer. Drop me a line. Just 12 years after the publication of The Four Feathers, the First World War broke out in August 1914. When Germany mobilised on the 1st of August 1914, it put 2.9 million men in the field within weeks, a conscript army built over 40 years. France mobilised nearly 3.8 million men by the 18th of August. The British Expeditionary Force that was sent to the Western Front comprised of just 100,000 men. The cry went out in the recruiting posters, "Your country needs you," and it certainly did. By the end of August, about 300,000 men had answered that call. It was an extraordinary response, the largest voluntary enlistment in British history. As conscription wouldn't be introduced for 2 years, the British war effort depended on volunteers. Every able-bodied man was needed, and despite the enthusiasm and patriotism in those early months of the war, the British lagged way behind both their allies and their enemies. Enter Admiral Charles Penrose Fitzgerald. Born in 1841 in County Cork into an Anglo-Irish naval family, he joined the Navy aged 13 in 1854, aboard Nelson's old flagship, HMS Victory at Portsmouth. His service career saw him participate in the Crimean War, the Second Opium War in China, and the Anglo-Egyptian War of 1882. The same campaign that in fiction would see Harry Faversham resign his commission and receive his white feathers. Fitzgerald had retired in 1901 and moved to Folkestone, where he became a long-standing supporter of Field Marshal Lord Roberts and the National Service League, the conscriptionist movement that spent the Edwardian years arguing voluntary recruitment couldn't produce the army Britain would need in a European war. Now aged 72, as Britain scrambled to recruit young men in 1914, he felt vindicated. It so happened that Folkestone, his retirement home, was the main embarkation point for the British Expeditionary Force heading to France. From up on the Leas, the clifftop promenade running along the seafront, he watched the troops marching through the streets, led by bands and cheered by locals as they headed to their ships. He also saw young men of military age walking along the promenade, still in civilian clothes. Why hadn't they enlisted? Were they, like those half-breed game birds, showing a white feather and running away? His anger boiled over, and he warned the men of Folkestone in a letter to the local paper that there is a danger awaiting them far more terrible than anything they can meet in battle. On Sunday the 30th of August 1914, 26 days into the war, Admiral Fitzgerald arranged for 30 women to walk along the Leas above Folkestone and present white feathers to any man of military age not wearing a uniform. He called these women the Order of the White Feather. The press picked it up immediately, and within days the actions of the Order, which was also dubbed by the newspapers the White Feather Brigade, had spread to countless towns and cities across Britain. Anecdotal evidence suggests that actually in the days following such campaigns in a town, enlistment levels did indeed rise, but how much is hard to ascertain. Despite Fitzgerald's grandiose name, the Order was never a nationally organised campaign, but more a series of copycat actions. Two prominent women now organise their own localised white feather campaigns. Baroness Emma Orczy, the Hungarian-born British author of The Scarlet Pimpernel, published in 1905, and one of the most popular adventure novelists of the Edwardian age, founded her parallel, Women of England's Active Service League, asking women to pledge never to be seen in public with a man of military age who hadn't enlisted. Within weeks, she had 20,000 signatories. Meanwhile, Mary Augusta Ward, the founding president of the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League. Yes, there was a movement opposed to women having the vote. We didn't get taught that at school, did we? Also advocated that her members take similar action. And if you think it was just right-wing reactionary women handing out the white feathers, you'd be very mistaken. In a move that the old sea dog, Admiral Fitzgerald, would have been confounded by, the WSPU, the Suffragettes, now joined in. Quite literally, up to the moment that war was declared, the WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, had been conducting their own war against the British government. Buildings had been burned, paintings slashed, ministers attacked, hundreds of suffragettes were in prison. And then war broke out. In a remarkable about-turn, the government released every WSPU prisoner, and the WSPU agreed to suspend its suffrage campaign entirely and devote its resources to recruiting men for the army and women for war work. And whilst history tends to remember women and the suffragettes getting involved in the vital war work on the home front, what it tends to forget is that Emmeline Pankhurst was also a vociferous recruiting sergeant, urging her followers to push their loved ones into the armed forces. The WSPU's newspaper, The Suffragette, was renamed Britannia in 1915, and members handed out white feathers to every young man they encountered in civilian dress. There was a bitter paradox in this suffragette campaign. Whilst we all know that women didn't have the vote in 1914, what fewer people realise is that around 40% of British adult men didn't have the vote either, as they failed to reach the property qualifications that dated back to the 1880s. So, in a bizarre twist, women without the franchise were shaming men without the franchise into dying for a country in which neither of them could vote. Like all grassroots campaigns, the lines of engagement were blurred. Rather than waiting to hear why a man wasn't in uniform, the white feather would be thrust upon them. This irrespective targeting had many unforeseen results. 16-year-old James Lovegrove, an apprentice at a London firm of architects, was walking to work less than 3 months after the war broke out, when he was surrounded by a group of women in the street. He recalled in an interview in his 90s, "They started shouting and yelling at me, calling me all sorts of names for not being a soldier. Do you know what they did? They stuck a white feather on my coat meaning I was a coward. Oh, I did feel so awful, so ashamed. To compound his sense of shame, or guilt if you want to take your pick, he went to the music hall that night to cheer himself up, only to watch on stage Vesta Tilley, one of the great male impersonators of the Edwardian stage, come on stage dressed in a soldier's uniform, singing patriotic songs and inviting men in the audience to come up on stage and take the King's shilling. Recruiting sergeants stood ready in the wings. The next morning, Lovegrove went to the recruiting office. He was 16 years old, 5'6", 8.5 stone. The sergeant initially laughed at him with the line, "Looking for your father, sonny?" However, seeing his crestfallen face, he remeasured him and wrote down 6 feet 12 stone. He was in. So Admiral Fitzgerald in his white feathers had another recruit. He served in the loyal North Lancashire Regiment on the Western Front, including at the Battle of the Somme, just like Arnold Ridley, Private Godfrey. And despite contracting fever and nearly dying, he finished the war as a lieutenant, aged 20. James Lovegrove went on to become a successful businessman and died in Eastbourne in 1994, aged 95. For every Lovegrove, there was someone the campaign was never supposed to touch. Men in reserved occupations, wounded veterans on leave, discharged soldiers without their uniforms, men medically unfit, and in one extraordinary case, a man who'd received the Victoria Cross at Gallipoli. George Sampson was born in Carnoustie, Angus in 1889. A Royal Navy reservist, he was serving as a seaman aboard HMS Hussar when the war broke out. In April 1915, Sampson was attached to the Royal Naval Division for the Gallipoli landings. On the 25th of April 1915, the opening day of the campaign, he was on the SS River Clyde, the converted collier that was deliberately run ashore at V Beach, Cape Helles, packed with troops of the 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers, the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers and the Hampshire Regiment. What followed at V Beach was a slaughter. Turkish machine guns sighted up on the cliffs above the beach poured fire into the men coming off the River Clyde. Of roughly 2,000 men who tried to land at V Beach on the morning of the 25th of April, around 70% became casualties. The 1st Royal Munster Fusiliers and the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers were effectively destroyed as fighting units within the first 24 hours. Sampson spent the whole day exposed and under fire, helping wounded men off the ship and onto the lighters. He was hit 19 times, both machine gun and shrapnel wounds across his body, and he survived. He was awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions that day, gazetted on the 16th of August 1915. In October 1915, recovering from his wounds, Sampson returned home to Carnoustie in civilian clothes. The town was preparing a formal reception in his honour, where he was to be presented with a smoker's cabinet and a rose bowl as tokens of civic esteem. On his way to the reception, walking through his own hometown, a woman approached him as he was in civilian clothes and presented this Victoria Cross hero with a white feather. You might be shocked and also amused by that story, but the White Feathers campaign had a darker side too. In November 1914, Robert Greaves took his own life after being handed a white feather. Greaves had been classified as medically unfit for service due to a physical disability. The case was reported in the Mid-Sussex Times. A year later, a London taxi driver did the same after receiving a feather in the post. And about the same time, a West Middlesex coroner, examining yet another suicide, publicly condemned the white feather women for denouncing men without inquiring into the circumstances. Even in 1914, the government was starting to get concerned. The campaign that had begun as Fitzgerald's tactical initiative had grown into something the state itself had to manage, not by stopping the women, but by protecting their victims. Men in essential war work, munitions, dockyards, the railways, public services, they were all being challenged on the street, on trams, in public houses. These were men whose work the country needed at home. Losing them to the recruiting office would have damaged the war effort far more than gaining them as soldiers would ever have helped it. The Home Secretary, Reginald McKenna, responded by issuing a lapel badge, known as the King and Country Badge, or sometimes the On-the-War Service Badge, to men in state industries and other essential occupations. The badge marked them as men whose work was contributing to the war, even if they weren't in uniform. Now, the King and Country Badge protected men in essential war work, but it did nothing for a different and growing category of men. Those who'd already served, been wounded or invalided out, and had come home, and were humiliatingly becoming the recipients of white feathers. Reuben Farrow had lost a hand in an explosion on the Western Front. Riding a tram in civilian clothes, he was challenged aggressively by a woman who demanded to know why he wasn't doing his duty for his country. Farrow turned around in silence and showed her his missing hand. The woman, in Farrow's account later, apologised and fled the tram in humiliation. Similar stories were documented across the war. Future writer and composer Norman Demuth was a private in the war when he was discharged with wounds in 1916. He recorded receiving numerous feathers after returning home, including one on a bus from a woman who said, "Here's a gift for a brave soldier." Demuth took it, pushed it down the stem of his pipe to clean it, and then handed the dirty pipe cleaner back to her with the words, "You know, we didn't get these in the trenches." The other passengers in his later account barracked her off the bus, whilst he recalled laughing like mad. And then there was Arnold Ridley, Private Godfrey in Dad's army, but we'll come to him in a little while. In September 1916, the Silver War Badge was instituted. A circular, sterling silver lapel badge bearing the royal cipher, GRI for King George V, surmounted by a crown. Around the rim the inscription, "For King and Empire, Services Rendered." It was awarded to every member of the armed forces who had been discharged honourably as a result of wounds or sickness. By the end of the war and into the early 1920s, over 1.1 million Silver War Badges had been issued. When the Silver War Badge was first issued in September 1916, Arnold Ridley had just been discharged from the Somerset Light Infantry. The future Private Godfrey in Dad's army had been wounded by shrapnel in his legs, concussed by a rifle blow to his head, and had received bayonet wounds to both his left hand and his groin. Now, that hand injury prevented him from properly using his left hand for the rest of his life, and was part of the reason that for the majority of the time he carried a first aid satchel rather than a rifle in Dad's army. Ridley received his badge and was in Torquay in 1917 when a woman in a fox fur coat approached him. In his own words, given decades later, "I wasn't wearing my soldier's discharge badge. I didn't want to advertise the fact that I was a wounded soldier, and I used to carry it in my pocket." She promptly presented him with a white feather. When war came again in 1939, Arnold Ridley, who by the way is the great-uncle to the actress Daisy Ridley, was 43 years old. A wounded World War I veteran who'd certainly done his bit for his country. He nevertheless re-enlisted. Sent to France as an intelligence officer with the BEF in September 1939, within hours of landing at Cherbourg, the shell shock that had haunted him since 1916 came back. In May 1940, he was evacuated from Boulogne on one of the last British ships to leave the port before it fell. Soon afterwards, he was discharged from the army for the second time in his life, although in this war no silver badges were needed. Society had moved on. This time, conscription had been in place before hostilities even broke out, and reserved occupations were published and understood. There was no Order of the White Feather in the Second World War. When in April 1940, the Daily Mirror reported that some women in Doncaster had handed out white feathers to men in reserved occupations, the paper described them as nitwit girls and female louts, a far cry from 1914. Once discharged, Ridley joined the local Defence Volunteers, soon to become the Home Guard. And the Home Guard gave a uniform to over 1.5 million men who couldn't serve in the regular army. Wounded, the old, the unfit, essential workers. Men who no doubt would have received white feathers in the previous war. When peace returned, Ridley resumed an acting career that had started after the First World War, He'd also written the play, by the way, The Ghost Train. And in 1968, now aged 72, he was cast as Private Charles Godfrey in Dad's Army. He played the gentle character in the platoon. Soft voice, slightly dithery, the medical orderly carrying his first aid satchel thanks to that genuine war injury to his hand. In November 1969, the second series of Dad's Army aired an episode called Branded. In the episode, Captain Mannering is appalled to discover that Godfrey, according to the script, was a conscientious objector in the First World War. But then the truth comes out. Godfrey hadn't actually refused to serve. He, like many conscientious objectors, had served as a stretcher bearer and had been awarded the military medal for going out under fire to bring in wounded men. Mannering and the rest of the platoon felt suitably chastised. What a fantastic irony. The man playing the falsely accused coward in Dad's Army had himself been falsely accused of cowardice by that woman in Torquay. Arnold Ridley, aged 88, died quietly in 1984. If you love learning about the people and events that made Britain such an incredible country, not just the battles, but the wider events through the centuries, then you might enjoy my free weekly newsletter. This week, for instance, I was looking at England's last Republican ruler, Oliver Cromwell's son, Richard. Start getting your copy by clicking on the link in the description, and let's keep proudly sharing stories from British history.